Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. It's great to see everybody again. Welcome to Cosmopolitanism Continued, the second chapter in my investigation as to how nationalism and anti-cosmopolitan sentiments affected the development of art song in Russia. My October presentation, Condemned Cosmopolitanism, began by exploring the birth of Russia's art song tradition. Historic evidence demonstrates that many civilizations' greatest achievements were established during periods of increased cosmopolitanism, when people, ideas, and artistic creations are shared openly between cultures and nations. The cultivation of Russia's cosmopolitan age began with Peter the Great, and followed by Empress Elizabeth, Catherine the Great, and finally Tsar Nicholas I. During this approximately 170-year period, the royal courts placed premium value on all aspects of European culture, adopting the clothing, language, arts, and especially the music of their neighbors to the west. Empress Elizabeth was partial to Italian opera, while Catherine, on the other hand, favored the French tradition and its mélodie. In Condemned Cosmopolitanism, I discussed how Glinka, known as the father of Russian music, was in fact a largely cosmopolitan composer whose compositional periods correspond with his studies and trips abroad. His vocal music is recognized for its lyrical, Italianate melodies and convincing impersonations of accompanimental figures made famous by composers in the Italian bel canto style. Moreover, influence from the French mélodie and its strict commitment to declamation and conservancy of text was overtly influential on generations of Russian composers. In fact, the French genre and compositional style was so prominent that it inspired the title of the Russian genre, the Romance, after the French Romance. The War of 1812 brought the country together under a robust sense of narodnost, which is Russia's version of nationalism, promoting the celebration and appreciation of Russian culture and history, as well as Russian cultural identity and unity. This period also saw Russia's leading composers fractured in their approaches to enhancing Russia's musical notoriety at home and abroad. Mily Balakirev and his mighty handful, aka the Moguchoya Kuchka, did their best to essentially cancel all European influence on Russian music, firmly believing that the answer to developing Russia's music tradition lie within folk song traditions and a reverence to language and poetry. Anton Rubinstein stood in opposition as the leader of the conservative movement in Russia's classical music development. He was passionate about enhancing Russia's musical notoriety at home and abroad, but he felt as though the most effective route was through structured education based on the pedagogical models of European conservatories. He displayed great national pride through the promotion, patronage, and programming of works by native Russian composers, but he remained openly inclined to lean on his own cosmopolitan compositional techniques. It is no surprise, then, that he became close friends with the OG queen of cosmopolitanism herself, Pauline Viardot. Pauline was one of the greatest singers and composers of her era and has been receiving a lot of press lately as we have just passed her 200th birthday. Viardot wrote over 100 songs in 5 languages, expertly capturing the national trends and sonorities of each country. Pauline was born in Paris in 1821 to a family of famous singers with the notorious Manuel Garcia I at the patriarchal head. At a young age, she showed prodigious talent at the piano, taking a few lessons with Franz Liszt and eventually becoming close friends with Friedrich Chopin, which lasted their entire lifetimes, that friendship. It was her desire to become a concert pianist, but after her father's death in 1832, Pauline's mother forced her to focus on singing and took her away from the piano. Viardot was highly regarded for her immaculate vocal technique and dynamic expressivity. Operatic engagements and her own sheer determination took her to the greatest concert halls around the world, eventually stopping in Russia from 1843 to 1846. Though she was there to sing Italian operas, Viardot quickly developed an affinity for the Russian language and art song. It was actually she who began the tradition of interpolating Alyavev's Solovey into the music lesson scene of Rossini's Barbara of Seville. April Fitzlion notes in her biography on Viardot that The press reported that Pauline pronounced Russian vowels like a true Muscovite. She had always displayed a noteworthy facility for foreign language acquisition, but seeing how Russian audiences reacted to hearing songs in their native tongue inspired a new pursuit. She considered she had a mission to make Russian music better known and appreciated in both Western Europe and in Russia itself. It may have been impertinent for a foreigner to endure such a mission, but Pauline must be given credit for having done much to make the music of Glinka, Dargamushki, and later Borodin and Tchaikovsky known to the West. She was not unequivocally endorsed by the Russian public, as Fitzlion also found a newspaper citing that at the time, Viardot has many ill-wishers in St. Petersburg, especially since she began to acquaint us Russians with Russian music. Regardless, Pauline Viardot enjoyed singing concerts of works by Glinka, Dargamushki, and their contemporaries, periodically with Anton Rubinstein accompanying her at the piano. It is difficult to mention Viardot's songs in Russian without acknowledging the influence of poet Ivan Turgenev. Turgenev was considered Alexander Pushkin's heir to poetic distinction in Russia, but was often criticized for his lack of overt nationalism. Turgenev's friends and even the media raised many indictments against Viardot, claiming that she was purposefully intoxicating the poet to distract his fervor and national loyalty. Turgenev did indeed spend a substantial amount of time with the Viardots, initially serving as Pauline's Russian tutor and friend, with considerable evidence suggesting that the two developed a lifelong love affair. His participation was integral to the dissemination of Viardot's art songs, as he helped her choose Russian poetry to set to song, helped her translate her non-Russian songs so they could be published and enjoyed by a Russian audience, and assisted with the translation of her Russian songs to Western European languages for publication and distribution. The excerpts that you're going to hear today perfectly illustrate Viardot's personal compositional style and how she blended this into convincingly authentic Russian art song. As I mentioned last year in my presentation, or last month, my presentation on condemned cosmopolitanism, the most critical elements of Russian music were established by the treatises and practices of the Moguchoye Kuchka. An emphasis was placed on innovation in harmony, use of modality, use of the flat sixth scale degree, and connections to folk song traditions and sonorities. You can hear how Viardot incorporates all of these elements within her own signature compositional style that exemplifies virtuosic writing for both the voice and the piano, sensitivity to text and emotional content, and a harmonic restlessness that migrates between distantly related keys via pivot tones and compact modulations. Viardot's songs often remind me of a Ron Popeil infomercial, where you think, the song or the infomercial is done, but then she pivots and gives you a musical, but wait, there's more. At this point, I would like to invite up Dr. Kay Kim, and we will drift toward the musical portion of the evening. Before playing the Viardot set, I wanted to bring one melodic Easter egg to your attention that caught my ear when I was first learning this repertoire. When playing through the accompaniment to the third piece in our set today, I couldn't figure out why it was so familiar. It was, in fact, so familiar that I was sure I had heard it before, but was equally confident that the piece was entirely new to me. It dawned on me a couple months later when I was assigning repertoire to one of my baritones and gave him one of my favorite pieces by Alexander Alyabev, who is considered the grandfather of Russian art song. So on the left, you can see the intro to his song Kabak, which Dr. Kim will play for us. Great, and then on the right side, we can see the intro to Viardot's Achievo Skaji. Thank you, Dr. Kim. So as you can hear, they're not exactly the same, but it definitely made me wonder whether she based this thematic material on Alyabev's piece, or if they both based their themes off the same Russian folk tune. So I will let you know if I ever find out. But in the meantime, we're going to move on to listening to some of Pauline's music.
Brusta sva, nie vidjelu
Moving on to Sergei Prokofiev, for who the sake of this presentation I am designating a cosmopolitan connoisseur, obviously a theme of alliteration here. He was born in 1891 in a remote section of the Russian Empire that is now recognized as part of Ukraine. Music was a meaningful part of his mother's life, and she provided his introductory piano lessons. He displayed prodigious talent, and after a few lessons with composer and teacher Alexander Glazunov, he urged the Prokofievs to send their son to the conservatory to pursue a career as a professional musician, stating with blunt insistence that if a child with your abilities, If a child with abilities like your son's shouldn't be sent to the conservatory, then who should? Throughout his life, Prokofiev kept routine journals and habitual correspondences with his mother and close friends, providing considerable insight as to how the revolutionary events in the country affected him early on in his life. And the answer is actually minimally. The city violence, strikes, and conservatory riots that followed the events of the Bloody Sunday massacre of 1905 seem to have little emotional effect on the 14-year-old pianist. In his letters, he dutifully reported the events with the indifferent, detailed precision of a newscaster. The musical developments leading up to the Bolshevik Revolution seem to have little influence on his compositions as well. As David Nice poses in his biography of Prokofiev, how could it have happened that he did not hear the true music of the revolution, that his works bear no trace even of the fiery rhythms of the revolutionary songs which filled the air of the Russian cities at the time? Well, when Lenin returned from exile and the Bolsheviks attempted to seize power, Prokofiev's mother had whisked him away to compose in the quiet countryside. During his time at St. Petersburg Conservatory, Prokofiev was viewed as a musical rebel and felt as though he was not receiving his due admiration. Hence, after completing his studies, Sergei was determined to conquer the musical territory abroad. Only intending to tour for about a year or so, Prokofiev was granted reluctant permission in 1918 by Cultural Affairs leader Anatoly Lunacharsky, who told him, You are a revolutionary in music as we are in life. We should work together. But if you want to go to America, I will not stand in your way. It was Prokofiev's original intent to reach the United States via South America, but he missed his boat from Japan to Valparaiso and ended up going directly to San Francisco. He did not experience the warmest reception in the United States and wandered the coasts before finding a more stable footing in Chicago. His luck seemed to turn around when he secured commission from the Chicago Opera Company to complete his opera The Love for Three Oranges, which he had begun writing on the boat ride to San Francisco. At the same time, he was writing his Opus 35, 5 songs without words, finishing them in December of 1920 on a short trip to Los Angeles. The cycle of vocalises was originally composed for Ukrainian soprano Nina Koshitz, described as one of the greatest sopranos of her time, and for who Rachmaninoff wrote his Opus 38. Prokofiev wrote the set to capitalize on Nina's sense of rubato, secure tone, and immaculate breath control. The rich, otherworldly harmonies provide a silken and vibrant ambiance through which the wide-ranging vocal melodies alternate between passionate dominance and expressive counterpoint. David Nice describes them in the following manner. The pitching and irregularity of the melodies, which etch themselves into the mind after a second or third hearing, are far from easy to negotiate, though the shapes become easier and more identifiably the composer's own in the last 2 songs as he moves from the fugitive visions to the dance-like clarity of his more elegant earlier piano pieces. So we're only going to hear the first 3 within this cycle to save time to hear a couple selections from Prokofiev's Opus 104, which he to compare his output after returning to Russia and settling permanently in Moscow in 1936. In the meantime, you will hear the characteristics most closely associated with Prokofiev's music as he was composing abroad. Most scholars agree that he deferred to classical forms, created graceful melodies with lyrical charm and athletic wide leaps, and employed harmonic language that embodied a bright effervescence, exhibiting whole-tone exoticism, impressionistic tenderness, and harmonic piquancy. A most applauding endorsement comes from Richard Tereskin, who states, Prokofiev's facility of invention will never cease to amaze me. Likewise, his gift for finding melodies and harmonies that are simple enough for anyone to like, yet are stylistically unique, convincing, and at their best, magically evocative. Just too early. Okay. So while Prokofiev was abroad, his homeland was experiencing major political, social, and economic upheaval. The 1917 revolutionary overthrow of the Russian monarchy heaved the country into civil war through 1923, and tensions were high as Russia was also trying desperately to avoid embarrassing defeats in World War I. The Bolshevik Party was finally able to establish the Soviet Union in 1923, but Lenin knew that restructuring the country could not be achieved solely through economic and political means. He would have to conduct a major campaign of hearts and minds through the implementation of unified cultural ideas. As Amy Nelson explains in her book, Music for the Revolution, although they knew it would take time, the Bolsheviks firmly believed that the liberating potential of the revolution would only be achieved with the evolution of a new level of consciousness that involved changes in everything from morality, hygiene, and forms of personal address to education, the use of technology, and new modes of artistic expression. She goes on to clarify that the new leadership well understood that music's influence on the emotions made it a powerful, mobilizing device. Songs had been valuable allies to the revolutionary movement. They should come to serve as powerful weapons in the class struggle and become important tools of the proletariat in building communism. By properly influencing people's emotions, it should strengthen elements of proletarian ideology in the masses. Lenin famously declared that arts and culture should arise from the masses, but he and other educated government officials also believed that the working class was still underdeveloped and backward and needed to be educated before a genuinely and acceptable proletarian culture could emerge. In order to aid in the development of the proletarian culture, the government established the Commissariat of Enlightenment, so this is also referred to as Narkompros, and funded an array of programs that offered musicians, writers, and artists employment and the opportunity to continue pre-revolutionary activities, albeit under radically different circumstances. The goal of the revolutionary project was, of course, a complete rupture from the past, casting off all things resembling pre-revolutionary tastes or expectations so that the country could move forward to a new, more democratic utopia. To guide the Soviet Union toward the development of a healthy democratic art, Anatoly Lunacharsky constructed a system of aesthetics that led to the establishment of socialist realism. Socialist realism was based on the idea that if art was grounded in reality and promoted the goal of strengthening the communist regime, it would clearly unify the Soviet Union and make it a better place. Problems arose, however, when art reflected actual states of poverty and destitution rather than what government officials wanted the country to become. Socialist realist art that was sanctioned and approved by the censors was far less realistic and, in fact, falsely glorified the present and should more accurately be titled socialist idealism, forcing an atmosphere of toxic optimism or toxic positivity. Advisory bodies like the Russian Association of Proletarian Musicians or the Organization of Revolutionary Composers also played a formative role in defining what socialist realist music should be, or at the very least what it should not be. They ran a vehement campaign against rootless cosmopolitanism, but definitions and expectations for what was allowed were ambiguous and constantly evolving. Most concerns stemmed from a widespread frustration over the lack of a unified artistic policy. Music in particular presented major challenges for censors because unless there were lyrics, it was difficult to identify content and the composer's intent. Nelson explains, as with the coming of the Messiah, no one could predict where or in what form this music would appear, but everyone felt sure they would recognize it when they did. Across the aesthetic and political spectrum, critics equated the spirit of the revolution with large-scale works. To convey revolutionary pathos, music required monumental nost, a realization of deep-seated longing for great monumental art that was strong-willed, dynamic, and easily comprehended. having bold, clear rhythms and simple, natural expression of melodic line. The Soviet Union was to be a socialist haven of democratic equality, so anything that did not serve the aims of the party or the people, or at least what the party wanted to impose on the people, was to be extinguished. This created major problems for classical musicians, composers, and anyone involved in the conservatory-style education system that encouraged elitism and the bourgeois image of an individualist creating art for art's sake. Instead, the governing bodies repeatedly insisted that musical activities were not merely entertainment or a means of relaxation for tired workers. Rather, the objective of musical work was to prepare politically conscious citizens to overcome bourgeois musical tastes as well as bourgeois ideology. Music was to awaken collective feelings, glorify the heroism of the working class, and help emancipate workers from the grip of religion and other vices. Grievously, more cosmopolitan and experimental composers like Prokofiev, Shostakovich, and others were frequently accused of formalist tendencies, writing music that was criticized for being decadent and counter-revolutionary. They were forced to navigate the undulating restrictions and demands for art reflecting socialist realism, compromising their artistic endeavors to avoid condemnation. It is difficult to know exactly why Prokofiev chose to return to Russia during a period of time when artists and composers faced such an unpredictable future. Few authors suggest that it was as simple as a yearning for his homeland. He had only intended to leave for a year, but ended up abroad for over 8. Others suggest that it was a need for recognition. He was the number 2 composer in Europe after Stravinsky, the number 2 Russian composer in America after Rachmaninoff, and the Commissar of Enlightenment led him to believe that he would be exempt from political pressure if he were to return home and be free to compose his best works for the world's best working class. Unfortunately, that was not true, and even worse, he remained the number 2 composer in Russia after Shostakovich. Taruskin goes on to explain that his music, despite assurances from Lunacharsky, was severely watchdogged and during his last 5 years mostly banned from performance. He wrote potboilers to celebrate revolutionary anniversaries and Stalin birthdays, but they have tarnished his reputation. Prokofiev and a handful of other composers were publicly denounced in the 1948 Zhdanov Doctrine for the subjectivism and intentional complexity of their musical language and for their disposition to formalist tricks that are alien to the aesthetic outlook of the Soviet people. The following excerpts from Prokofiev's Opus 104 illustrate one of his attempts to compose in a simpler style that was consistent with socialist realism. However, the standard accusation of formalism was leveled at Prokofiev's folk arrangements because he treated folk song melodies freely as if they were his own. Jealous shed zu paguyati, pazo ulcam pere ulcam paplutati, da pazo ulcam pere ulcam paplutati, pazo ulici da pashiraki. Strishu, strishu, shere tu trital pizzi, si saruki, da trital pizzi, si saruki, shere tu da payas papaniles. Cerne cishe, klamu cishe, na habuchil, suri nai, na habuchil, nina yuta diela non, shejeniti, sia majo diela spasatza, Встречу червецу, тритал пиццы, молодицы, да, тритал пиццы, молодицы, черничише, колбачише, я нас присна. Встречу червецу, тритал пиццы, три девицы, да, тритал пиццы, три девицы, да, какие три девицы? Черничише, клавучише, обобросил, зури, най, обобросил, нека полна черецу, подумали-то не пора ли добру молодцу жениться, не пора ли жениться, не пора ли добру молодцу жениться, не на душенька на красной на девице, не на душенька на красной на девице, зури, най, девице. The government entities did their best to control the culture and music dispensed throughout the country, but radical changes were taking place in the Soviet social structure by the 1930s, and the country was going through an accelerated urbanization accompanied by important cultural changes. The USSR was a melting pot of fringe elements because of voluntary and forced resettlement, socialism's top priority construction projects, and mass migration from one end of this huge country to the other. So Lenin's original insistence that the dominant culture should be proletarian and come from the people presented significant challenges that are easily recognized once one understands that the entire proletariat covered the area that we now recognize as these 15 countries with 100 distinct nationalities and over 2 million industrial workers. Government leaders tried to mold an acceptable dominant culture through efforts of kulturerstvo, literally meaning bringing culture, in the hopes that art could overcome divisions within Russian society, to break down the walls between professional musicians and the people and join the masses who are pining for music in the depths of their souls. Veiled within this was a deep-rooted hostility toward popular culture that embraced cosmopolitan forms and bourgeois decadence. The RAPM and the ORK did their best to abolish any music that indulged individual emotions, pushing instead songs that focused on the travails and exploits of the revolutionary period, Lenin's and Stalin's leaderships, and the historic, glorious destiny of the Soviet Union. This acceptable repertoire included worker songs, marches, revolutionary songs, Soviet mass songs, and agitki, a label developed for the agitational art and poetry of the Civil War. They were utilitarian and had a very specific purpose. They were also very repetitive and very boring, and the proletariat did not much care for them. Instead, the working class preferred the light genres that featured syncopated dance rhythms, sentimental lyrics, harmonic suspensions, and chromatic melodic conventions. Many songs from these genres were written with a hint of nostalgia and a nod to the Russian romance of the 19th century. That vocab word we started with today. The condemned genres that included such decadent and intoxicating practices were Western European waltzes and tangos, American foxtrots, and the Soviet Union's very own cruel romances, underworld songs, and Tsiganskina songs. The government officials saw them as a narcotic distraction that dulls the will and discourages striving and development. The suspensions, melodic chromaticism, and heart-rending skips by minor sixths and sevenths conveyed decadent dissoluteness and lack of will. What's more is that the cruel romances and underworld songs were distinguished by their overwrought, trite music and ironic melodramatic lyrics about illicit love, betrayal, or infidelity, telling the woes and exploits of homeless children, criminals, and the down and out. Not exactly topics that portray socialist idealism or glorify the state of the Soviet Union. The presentation will close today with a set of songs by composers who faced harsh persecution for their artistic contributions, particularly those depicting the revival of the Russian romance. Boris Prozorovsky's songs amassed considerable acclaim with the general public, but the government deemed his work counter-revolutionary. He was arrested in 1930 and sent to a Gulag labor camp for 3 years. He continued to write and perform after his release, but was subsequently arrested and executed in 1937. Boris Fomin was never able to complete his education at the St. Petersburg Conservatory, as his studies were interrupted by the 1917 revolution. However, he quickly found himself in favor with Lenin and volunteered to join the Red Army. Unfortunately, his status curdled by 1929, and several of his songs were banned before facing arrest and political imprisonment in 1937. These emotionally charged romances integrated folk idioms and elements of klezmer music to create a genre evoking the cherished cabaret pieces by composers including Kurt Weill, Friedrich Hollander, Eric Satie, and many others. Though their music was suppressed by the Soviet censors, a handful of pieces made their way across borders and overseas, finding favor in Europe and the United States. These most certainly embody the intoxicating suspensions and indulgent chromaticism so despised by the Bolshevik leaders. So I apologize ahead of time if you leave the recital hall today with a sense of decadent dissoluteness or an affinity for sentimentality. Written in Russia, 1924, was premiered in 1925, but actually became very popular in the United States in the 1960s. So I'm going to sing the first three verses in Russian, but when we get to the final chorus, you will see me do this. So if you know the words, I know at least one person in this audience knows the words. My mom's here tonight. But if you know the words, please sing along. So I will sing in English the very last chorus.